Welcome back. We are joined today by Nicolai Petro, a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island, and also formerly the U.S. State Department Special Assistant for Policy on the Soviet Union. So thank you for coming back. I've been looking forward to speaking with you.
Nice to be with you, Glenn.
So when it appears that the war in Ukraine is coming to an end. Again, one should be careful to stare into the crystal ball and make too many predictions. But in terms of military defeat, it's no secret anymore that the collapse on the Ukrainian side seems to be intensifying. And of course, with Pokrovsk, this will, I guess, change a lot of things. But people look at different indicators. It can be the military, it can be the economic, as the economic problems keep piling on. It could be social problems, as many of the men in the country has either fled the country or are in hiding from Zelensky's military recruiters to get them. There's anger towards the government. More and more people want an end to this war and negotiations, proper negotiations. And but the war could also come to an end because of the lack of political stability. I think Zelensky's position seemed to be weakening, or furthermore with a corruption scandal. And I guess another indicator will be the declining international support that is across the Western public, but also the ability to finance this whole thing and provide the military equipment. Indeed, the U.S. washing its hands with it is a good indicator of at least they being less capable of fighting as they did in the past. But how do you assess this very critical time now for both Ukraine and NATO in this proxy war? Well, if you would look at the economic first, I guess, how do you see this situation?
So I've been trying to gather and summarize information that would suggest that, as you have argued, that the prospects for Ukrainian victory are slim. And I've come up with, I think, 4 major reasons. One is, they are in order. The Ukraine is running out of soldiers, it's running out of money, running out of people. I guess there's 3. And just to summarize what I've been able to gather, according to the Ukrainian prosecutor general, 40 to 50% of the Ukrainian armed forces are currently considered deserters or absent without leave. On a monthly basis, according to the former prosecutor general, Igor Lutsenko, 2/3 of the recruits desert, and 10,000 leave the conflict as casualties in a month. So even though they're able to recruit 30,000 a month, all of that doesn't add troops ultimately because of the high number of desertions and deaths. Running out of money, well, there's been a lot of writing about that recently. In a nutshell, the anticipated deficit is over 18%. So it'll need to raise, just to use some round numbers, somewhere between 100 billion, at least 100 billion, according to analyst Timothy Ash, over the next year and a half, just to stay in the game. That's in addition to what has already been allocated. And the Pearl financing instrument, which is the latest instrument devised by the coalition of the willing to fund Ukraine, has come up with a total commitment of 2. 2 billion so far. So they have a long way to go to meet Ukraine's basic needs to stay in the war. Absent this, default is inevitable, which can be dealt with, in a variety of ways. And I'll get to that a bit later. But I guess ultimately I wouldn't say Ukraine is forced to end the war, and I'll explain why in a second. The third is Ukraine's running out of people. I think BBC Ukraine estimated that there are now 28.7 million people in Ukraine, down from a high of 52 million in 1991. The death rate is the highest in the world. The birth rate is the lowest in the world. And none of this bodes well for the future of Ukraine. So, from a rational perspective, yes, Ukraine should, at its earliest opportunity, seek the chance to negotiate a settlement, because the only alternative to negotiation is surrender, at which point you don't have any ability to negotiate further. So a lot of Ukrainian analysts who are opposed or skeptical of the regime strategy say, given these scenarios, the country should be negotiating already so that it can get the best deal that it can. As long as Russia is still willing to negotiate, we still have a chance to pull something out and survive. Because once there is a settlement, many, not all, but many of these negative trends can begin to reverse. There might be, with the support of Europeans, some sort of fund set up for rebuilding Ukraine. There will be some repatriation of the millions of people who have left Ukraine, although the latest survey by Professor Golovanka of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences finds that only about a third now are thinking about returning, even after the war ends, of those who have migrated. But nevertheless, every individual helps the rebuilding of Ukraine. But absent a ceasefire and a settlement, I distinguish between the two, because under a ceasefire, I don't think there will be many investors, foreign investors, who would take that risk to invest large sums of money in what is an unstable situation. However, with a long-term peace treaty, such investment becomes possible. But I want to get to your bigger question, and I think it's an interesting one. Does this mean that Ukraine will commence negotiations seriously, because it has rejected negotiations so far? In effect, it has said first ceasefire, then negotiations, which is, of course, not the way negotiations ever in history have gone. Yeah. As someone pointed out recently in an article, the Vietnam War negotiations continued for a number of years without a ceasefire. The ceasefire is the first tangible result of peace negotiations. And if not, then we have a situation, as we have in Korea, where there is no actual, the war is still on. Technically, the United States is still at war with North Korea, but there is a prolonged ceasefire. But that's an anomaly because, as historians know, the intent was to conduct a ceasefire, to have the ceasefire, then institute a total arms embargo for both North and South Korea, essentially forcing both sides into a long-term peace settlement that was supposed to be signed, ratified at least, at the Geneva Summit of 1954. But then, in the meantime, the United States forgot about Korea and began to be interested in Vietnam. So its interest in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, shifted entirely, and they simply forgot about Korea, considering it's settled. I don't think that'll be the case here. I think the scenario in Ukraine, given the nationalist sentiments in the country, is more likely to be similar to that in the Middle East, where we have had periodic cessations of fire, but at any moment things can commence again. And that is, of course, exactly what hardcore Ukrainian nationalists are anticipating, would essentially like to see as a way of resolving this. So, given the complexity internally, and given the fact that many European leaders, it seems to me, have sunk too much of their political careers into the defense of Ukraine, that they are unwilling to give up their maximalist goals for Ukraine. There hasn't been sufficient pain, and there are not enough pain for them and their countries to warrant a change in policy. Europe seems to be all in, fighting to the very last Ukrainian, because the costs for them are minimal. As a matter of fact, there are more benefits to continuing the war for current European leaders than there are for ending it. Specifically, over the next 5 years, which is an entire lifespan for a political figure in Europe, what they have to look forward to is priming the pump economically, a massive increase in spending in the military, and I think they'll argue that there'll be some sort of multiplier effects from that, and they will argue that that is all to the good because it defends Europe, it increases or it decreases unemployment, and offers a chance to secure the state in more ways than even militarily. There'll probably be restrictions on borders. There'll be all sorts of domestic legislation which will seek out the enemies of the state, many of which will be designated as being from Russia, but not only. They can be from a lot of other countries as well. And all of this will give centrist and center-left parties just the right tinge, they think, of a right-wing politics in order to appeal and draw support away from the rising influence of far-right parties in Europe. So I don't see your current European leaders giving up on their current strategy. And that will give an unwarranted hope to the current Ukrainian leadership, and they're likely to continue, I think, the war as long as is humanly and inhumanly possible, unfortunately.
Well, if you take a look at the Russian side, they, I think, they would be very interested to get an agreement or get the war over with, to again, well, end the killings and of course get some proper settlement. But that being said, my impression is that the closer Ukraine gets to a collapse, the less incentives the Russians will have to accept any compromise or deal. And well, part of the reason, at least my impression, is that they don't believe that anything that the West sign will actually be honored, because they look back towards 2014. The Europeans were supposed to be a guarantor for this unity government. They remember the Western countries signing the Minsk agreement, but they also remember in 2019 when the Western countries pressured Zelensky to abandon the peace platform. They remember 2022 sabotaging Istanbul, and indeed, NATO altogether wasn't even supposed to expand. They had the agreements of this toward the end of the Cold War. So, they can look at the Partnership for Peace in the 90s. This was also seen as a deception. All the arms controls which fell apart. And even if we forward to the present time, all the calls for ceasefire, I mean, if you listen to the European leaders, they're quite open about what the ceasefire is supposed to achieve. It gives some breathing space to rearm Ukraine, allow them to recruit more troops, dig in, and prepare for continued warfare. So it's very hard to see why why the Russians would trust any agreement, especially an agreement which would allow any NATO troops or equipment to continue to flow into Ukraine. But if it comes to collapse, what do you think the Russians will seek to take? I mean, if you would look at it, besides the the humanitarian issues, that is the concern for the Russian speakers, the overall strategic focus seems to be, well, you would think if they take Odessa, this would make the country landlocked. It would make it not impotent, but it would make it very difficult for Ukraine to pose a threat to Russia again in the future as a NATO proxy or bridgehead. Do you see the Russians going for this, going all the way to Odessa? Because this is something that could really trigger a greater, at least French and British involvement, because they really want Odessa too, it seems.
No, yeah. Well, that was, I guess, part of the rationale for the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. And we know that under Minister of Defense, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense Reznikov, Ukraine did sign an agreement with the British military to set up a base on the Black Sea, a new fortification there that would be supported and funded by the British. So that those ambitions have lingered for a while. But I don't know. I have no idea what Russia's grand strategy is, and part of it will no doubt be opportunistic. In other words, it depends how far Russia might be willing to go in expanding its territory and influence will depend on how definitively Ukraine's defenses collapse. And there are many scenarios that one can imagine. However, Russia is psychologically and strategically at an advantage compared to Ukraine in that its stated objectives, namely the liberation of the 4 territories that it now claims and Crimea, so five regions, is at least plausibly within sight. Whereas Ukraine's military objectives, which have not changed since the invasion, are to restore the 1991 borders. So that's retake all 5 regions. And that seems increasingly implausible. So, assuming the most likely scenario that Russia achieves its stated military objectives, The question then becomes, how desirable is it to redescribe its objectives now, after 4 years of war? In other words, Russia's never had the objective to take all of Ukraine or to expand anywhere beyond the 5 regions. So it seems to me that if they achieved what they set out to, then they could declare victory and use that moment to exert considerable leverage, not only on Ukraine, but also in Europe, by not advancing, by saying, look, we have gotten rid of or eliminated essentially the defensive perimeter that Ukraine set up in the east. Now we could go further into Ukrainian territory and even reach Kiev and a strategically important city like Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro, and Odessa. But we don't want to do that. And if we can reach a meaningful peace treaty with Ukraine, we will not do that. It seems to me the attractiveness of doing that, of adopting that position for Russia, is that Ukraine, seeing the inevitability of further losses, some more rational heads in Ukraine might be willing at that point to negotiate, but also it would give the lie to a standard NATO narrative, which is that Russia heedlessly advances whenever it can and wants to take over all of Ukraine and will not even stop at the border of Ukraine. Well, if Russia stops at the objective, actually stops and seeks negotiations at the objective that it set 4 years ago and does not immediately move forward, I think that would be a considerable blow to the pro-war forces in Europe, and would suggest, and I would think would strengthen the hand of those who argue that negotiations are possible with Russia. Because, in fact, not many people outside of specific military industrial interests desire such a dramatic expansion of the military budget because of the costs that it would incur for people in Europe. It would basically not exactly hollow out, but dramatically shrink the social safety network in Europe. And that is not, the consequences of that are something that I think are not really well thought out, haven't been tested in EU politics yet. But, and I think it will not go well for those parties that support the war at the expense of social well-being.
Well, Russia's already entered, though, in a growing way, both Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk. And, well, it's I can imagine them be willing to trade those territories for what, for example,
I think it's a
Kherson.
tactical, a tactical rather than a strategic maneuver. I'm not a military analyst, but it seems to me also from the signals that you read Russia's sending, that you can read about in certain Western outlets, they seem to be suggesting a trade-off that would lessen the cost of taking the remainder of Donetsk, for example. Because Donetsk, so they have taken Bakhmut, Pokrovsk, Avdiivka, but there's still Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, a number of heavily fortified and large cities in Donetsk before the entire oblast is taken. So Russia's strategy has been to, they've taken this long, grinding, long-term and military strategy rather than a quick, decisive strike, because it allows them to diminish losses, to minimize, I should say, the losses on the Russian side. And even in this, as in previous sieges that they have undertaken in Donbas, they have offered opportunities for the Ukrainian soldiers to withdraw, but the Ukrainian soldiers have been ordered, apparently, by their commanders not to withdraw, and that has led directly to the very high casualties that Ukrainian forces are suffering now, because the Russians, again, have, as I understand it, such military artillery and drone dominance that the actual soldiers on the Russian side come in after the drones and the artillery strikes have done their work and are engaged essentially in mop-up operations.
But do you see still any pathway for diplomacy? Again, the things are going from bad to worse at an incredible speed, yet the Europeans do not seem that they have any intentions to even open up diplomacy with the Russians. They don't even want to talk to them, and instead there seems to be almost, as you suggested before, willingness to enter the war in some way. Indeed, the strategy for the Ukrainians appear to be to bring in NATO, and the strategy for the Europeans seems to be to try to pull in the Americans. So it's again, it's very hard to read some of these politicians if they really mean what they're saying. But again, the rhetoric is that preparing for war. They're saying they were preparing for war. The money being pumped into the military now. This is not a defensive budget. This is also for war. So one gets the impression that diplomacy is overall rejected, and preparations are made for war.
Having said that, I think you're right. Preparations are being made for war, but NATO currently is not ready for war and will not be ready for a number of years. As a result, if the war is finished by Russia before NATO feels comfortable engaging in the war, then I guess the game will be over for NATO. I think part of the rationale, the deeper rationale for supporting Ukraine at whatever level is possible, even a minimal one, and to give them all the rhetorical support that they can give, that NATO and the EU can give, is precisely to give not Ukraine a chance to survive, but rather to give NATO a chance to rearm, at which point its threats to intervene will be more credible. Because right now, I don't think they are very credible. All that NATO can actually do is through this coalition of the willing to send a few thousand, perhaps tens of thousands, but probably less than 50,000 troops. Remember, the entire British Army is what, 70,000 troops? 70, 80,000 troops. There just is not the manpower. There's not the technology. NATO is not prepared for war, which is why partly you see the very smallest countries, the very weakest countries in NATO, the Baltic states, for example, arguing that Big Brother, the larger members of NATO, should step up and fight, and then they'll send 1,000 troops. That'll be their participation, but the brunt of it will be on the shoulders of Germany and the United Kingdom and France, and as a result, there's a real divide in NATO that I think even now, despite the rhetoric, no major power in Europe is willing to commit forces. And if the smaller countries like the Baltic states continue to put on pressure that NATO should be should get involved directly, then I think it will lead to a rather dramatic split within the NATO alliance, between the hawks who are willing to fight first, but only if everybody else fights, and the more sober-headed older members of NATO who recognize at least that they can't do anything without the United States, and B, that they themselves would incur tremendous political losses, not to mention economic losses, but they would lose their political appeal in their own countries, and maybe not for just one election, but for a longer period of time than that, an entire generation.
Well, I think part of the panic in Europe, though, is not necessarily all about Russia or all about Ukraine. It's some great concerns what will happen to the continent after this war, because well, our politicians, they bet everything. They sent all their weapons. They sacrificed much of the European economies. They lied and pushed propaganda nonstop, and it seems more obvious now that they will not be in a position to write the history once this war is over. So, given that that so much has been bet on this, how do you think this? Well, what do you think Europe will look like after this war, if it ends with Russian military victory and essentially dictating the terms?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult situation for the mainstream parties in Europe, because they really have no good options. If they continue to fund the war, then it will drag out, but the consequences for them economically will be devastating. And although investment in the military will offset that a bit, there will be constant questions about that strategy and about Europe's inability to become again a leader in economic growth rather than merely a survivor. And that's the best scenario. If Russia wins, then these questions about all the strategic errors and misanalysis of the situation that the current governments since before 2022, let's say maybe 2014 on, have subjected the country to. All of this will be an issue of immediate political relevance, and they will be the scapegoats. Obviously, the current political elite will be the scapegoats. which could lead to an earthquake in European politics, the kind that essentially levels the field and creates new political parties and new political opportunities, sweeping away the great coalition, which was never meant to be recreated, by the way, after the last election in which the SPD in Germany, Social Democrats, broke away from the Christian Democrats precisely because they had no identity of their own in this great coalition, being constantly overshadowed by the larger party. Nevertheless, they went along with it this time, but the deeper argument of why anyone would ever vote for the Social Democrats when they will always be subordinate to their coalition partner, which ostensibly, ideologically, is in the opposite camp from them, the Christian Democrats. It makes no sense to have this grand coalition of centrist parties anymore, and I think people will increasingly search for some alternative to it. Although it doesn't necessarily mean that the far right or the alternative right will take its place. And even if it does, it will need coalition partners. But I think the names of the current generation of political parties might transmogrify into something else. In any case, I see a future in which the traditional parties disappear and are replaced by some sort of new political coalition, because the ideological definitions of Christian Democrat, Social Democrat made sense in the Cold War era. But in a global era, one dominated by Eurasian powers, in which Europe plays a secondary or even a tertiary role, I just it really makes little sense. And also, by the way, it's not just that Eurasia is rising; it's also that the alliance with America, the transatlantic alliance, no longer looks that desirable, and that was really the attraction of the centrist parties in Europe after World War II. There was only America to cling to because there was no alternative to the East. Today, there are a myriad of alternatives and a number of countries that Europe could ally itself with. Therefore, I think these other opportunities will eventually be discussed and become more attractive in post-Ukrainian war Europe.
Well, that's also my expectations that, as you said, that given that in the past America was the only game in town, it was something that unified. But how should the Europeans respond to the decline of US? Because some would favor to shore up what remains of the political West by reducing ties to China, Russia, and others to just pledge more loyalty to the US to build this political West. Others see that the best response to the decline of the US and also taking on more, I guess, an extractive tributary economy almost, where it wants more advantages from its partner states, that they see the main approach would be to diversify, to not put all their eggs in the one American basket, because then the Americans will be able to tell us what to do. But
Right.
the idea that you would have of 30 countries all agreeing on either the one or the other, given that they're mutually exclusive to a large extent, it's somewhat unrealistic. So the whole foreign policy, the idea that Greece and Latvia should have the same foreign policy, it seems more absurd or more distant now that the United States leaves, loses the interest in Europe and begins to at least reduce its presence.
Even if the United States were to turn around under a subsequent presidency and take a renewed interest in Europe, I think it would still be fighting an uphill battle to retain Europe's interests in a more balanced world of economic and political opportunities. The difference between the two scenarios that you just described is that one looks to the past and the other looks to the past, I should say, because it feels there is stability, predictability, and certainty in the past. That's what it is selling to the European public today. Don't worry about the future. Let's just do what we've always done and look to the United States. Even if the United States does not play the role that it traditionally has, we will nevertheless pretend that it is playing that role and sell that narrative to the European public as reassurance. The other alternative is harder to sell. It is look to the future and do not fear it. We don't know exactly where our alliances and best friends will be in a future world dominated by Eurasia, but it is a world of opportunity for Europe rather than one of fear. It is, I think, the latter view is a more hopeful one, but harder to sell, especially to current political elites in Europe. And there, I think that is where you begin to see different political elites in different countries making different strategic choices. And as a result, I think the EU can very well, has considerable potential to fragment into multiple similar organizations. After all, before the European Union became the European Union, there was the European Economic Community and the European Community, and its rival in Europe, the European Free Trade Association. The two coexisted very well. The basic difference philosophically between them is that the European Union was committed to some sort of multinational content, a definition of Europe as a single space, whereas the European Free Trade Association basically argued that all we really want is free trade, travel, and opportunity. And we don't want to create some sort of overarching European identity because we don't need that. So I think a revival of the European Free Trade Association as an alternative, I should say, to the European Union is quite plausible. I'm not sure I would say likely, but is certainly an idea that could be considered, especially if it could have good economic relations with its European neighbors, and that would certainly be in the interests of those who remain in the EU, but also at the same time have good, mutually profitable economic ties with the growing powers of Eurasia.
It's yeah, it's quite well. One can almost appreciate why the Europeans are in such a panic, though, because if the Ukraine would have been successful somehow in defeating Russia, you would have this greater Europe where you would have without Russia, of course, but you would have the Ukrainians as hundreds of thousands of troops, battle hardened, prepared to not just weaken but also marginalize Russia's role in Europe. The Americans would feel more comfortable to stay. It seems like in this fight it was really everything or nothing, and they rolled the dice, though.
I would say that's also from the point of view of Europe's current strategists, a short-sighted view, because all of the problems that led to Brexit and that are causing fragmentation within the European Union have existed for decades. And they would only have increased with further eastward expansion, especially with the incorporation of a Slavic Orthodox country like Ukraine into the EU. Every time there has been an eastward expansion, it has, I would say, encouraged the dreams of those who look for a pan-European entity, but at the same time, the states that are newly entered come with their own individual historical baggage and traditions, which have to be partly adapted to existing European ones, but also to change the existing political culture of Western Europe. And as a result, the EU, as we have seen in recent years, becomes much less, in fact, liberal. The EU, I love the EU as a liberal dream, as a dream for individual opportunity, but also the ability to transcend national divisions, free exchange of ideas, borders, people. All of that has now been reversed, and has done so. It cannot be said that this is only in reaction to the war, because everyone understands that the war, I would say, had it did not need to be engaged by Europe as it was. One of the reasons that the EU, I think, became so heavily involved was because of elites within the EU that were already seeking opportunities to exert greater control over the internal freedoms. And as a result, the violations of language rights, the violations of cultural rights of minority, the direct intervention in the political campaigns of countries in Eastern Europe, where the results are close, and there's a fear that a quote unquote pro-Russian party might win, are now unabashed, even though these directly contradict the original values of the EU. And as a result, that contradiction cannot be hidden anymore. And it inevitably will result in increased friction within the EU, I suspect, leading to some sort of split in the future.
Yeah, it is an interesting press conference where Viktor Orban sits next to Donald Trump, and he essentially says, well, the reason why all the Europeans decided to go all in, bet everything on this war, was because Biden more or less talked them into it. And so, yeah, essentially blaming the American counterpart for the Europeans losing their minds, and Trump sits there, nods along, and even when even when Orban makes this point that it was wait, what? Sorry, now I lost my thought here.
Biden's an easy scapegoat because he's no longer in power, and there's Orban is not a fool. He knows he doesn't have to insult current political leaders by making reference to their immediate predecessors, and blaming them. It's easier to put everything on Biden. But he said at other times that obviously the European political leadership that led us into the war into this war, into supporting this war wholeheartedly, are as much at fault as the previous American political leadership. And of course, the current political leadership is simply continuing their policies. So it's easy for any observer to draw the inference and the connection.
Well, the theatrics of Trump is also becoming quite evident, though, because he, not that long ago, was tweeting that Ukraine could win the war, but now when he was sitting next to Orban, he asked Orban, do you think they can win? And then he said, well, I guess miracles are possible, something, and Trump said yes and began to chuckle. I mean, this is, so it's quite evident he doesn't necessarily mean everything he says, rather it's, yeah, part of part of the show, I guess.
Even now, American analysts and every analyst from around the world looks at what Trump says, and I don't know. I think his strategy is just to not be predictable. If 1 week he says one thing, I think somewhere in his mind he's already thinking about saying the opposite within the next 2 weeks, because he feels that that gives him room for maneuver vis-a-vis all his many opponents, domestic as well as foreign. What he doesn't appreciate, and there's no reason for him to do so, it's not his job, but it should be the job of the Secretary of State and the professional analysts in the military and the intelligence community and in the State Department to point out to him that that he makes policy when he makes a statement. And when that statement contradicts itself back and forth, America appears unreliable and indecisive. And that too has consequences for how he can conduct policy. I don't think this gets through to him very easily, because even in his own businesses, as I understand it, he's atop $1 billion company. He actually should not be should not be involved in negotiation. The actual negotiations about what the evaluation of this is, what we're going to exchange for that property and this property, that's all done by lawyers and accountants, and he should be presented with the big picture and understanding what the grand strategy of his company is. He should sign on the dotted line as long as those parameters fit where he wants to head. But in this case, he's still conducting business, the business of America, the way he conducted his personal business, which is, I'm going to make the decision and everyone below me is going to do what I say. Well, in government, that's even less likely than in business.
He seems, well, I would say he seems to be learning it, but maybe not quite yet. Anyways, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate
My pleasure.
it. It's fascinating developments. One gets the impression that the changes which were previously month by month are now almost week by week, and then day by day. The changes are happening at increasing speed. So,
which, let's not forget, when we tend to be pessimistic about how there's a lack of predictability, that means predictability for bad things or for good things. The sudden breakthrough, the let's meet in Anchorage, the let's meet in Budapest, let's meet whatever, those opportunities also then arise out of this uncertainty. So let's not be too pessimistic.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.